Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. Mark Riebling will be my guest. The German Jesuit Alfred Delp wrote, "How do we represent our religion? Just as a system or as a glowing fire?" Delp was a key figure in the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And this particular story has never been better told than in Mark's work here, Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. It is shocking. You'll meet characters in this book that will just fill you with pride about Christian resistance to Hitler. And it is so unlike the pop culture impressions of the church's role. You're going to love it. I've shared this with a number of friends already. Everybody who's read this book has raved about it. I'm in my second read-through on it. I want Mark to share some of the research that he discovered. I've learned things in this book that I've never come across before. And my guest notes that Pope Pius XII ran the world's largest church, the smallest state, and the oldest spy service. He was saintly but secretive. He skimmed from church charities to pay covert couriers, and he surreptitiously recorded his meetings with top Nazis. When he learned of the Holocaust, he played his cards close to his chest. He sent birthday cards to Hitler even while he was secretly plotting to kill him. Joining me right now is Mark Riebling. He is the author of an outstanding book. My daughter had just read it. I've just read it. And Alexis claims that it is the best book she's read in 2 or 3 years. It's called Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. Mark is the co-founder of the Center for Policing Terrorism. His writings have appeared in The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. You can follow him on Twitter at Riebling, R-I-E-B-L-I-N-G, Mark. Mark, great to make your acquaintance. Thanks.
It's an honor and a pleasure, Al.
I love the book. I'll tell you right from the start, one reason I love it is because you have a great gift of dramatic narrative.
Thank you.
And I think that's often what's been lacking in some of the histories and some of the polemical works on this. You really create an environment in which there's real ambiguity at times and difficult moral decisions that are made. You get familiar with some of the lead characters through here. It's really a very moving book, and I greatly appreciate it as a reader, and of course I also appreciate it as a good presentation of Pius XII. So, and that's why I loved it. I was unfamiliar, by the way, in any. I'd heard the name, but really had no idea who Joseph Mueller was. Let's start with him, because that's where you begin. Who was Joseph Mueller?
Well, Joseph Mueller was really the ace of papal spies in Germany, and at the same time he was the Odysseus, if you will, very crafty agent within the German military resistance to Hitler. He was a Bavarian peasant of rather simple Catholic beliefs who rose from the backwoods of Bavaria to the opera boxes of Munich as a very in-lay Catholic who was a real political powerhouse in pre-war Germany. And once the Nazis took power, he used a lot of his connections as a Catholic lawyer to get people out of trouble, to get Jews out of trouble, to get Catholics out of trouble. And at the same time, he became a courier in this behind-the-scenes intelligence network that Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pope Pius XII, had set up while he was Secretary of State in the Vatican in the 1930s. The principal purpose of this intelligence network, which used behind-the-scenes informal contacts, was to get evidence that the Nazis were violating the Concordat, which they had signed with the Vatican in the summer of 1933, ostensibly guaranteeing church rights in Germany. But, of course, the Nazis, being the Nazis, proceeded to violate this in chapter and verse. But Pacelli said to one of the bishops at the time, he said, "Don't just give me, accusations or rumors. I want hard facts."
Right.
Well, Joseph Mueller, who had the colorful nickname Joey Ox, took it upon himself to give the Vatican these facts. But, of course, this was not easy because the Gestapo controlled means of communication. There was telephone surveillance. Mail was opened. The borders were closed. So Joey Ox would fly Vatican secrets from Munich to Italy, to Murano, from Munich in a single-seat sports plane over the Alps, which was quite a dangerous Sunday activity. And he would then land in Murano, and a Vatican courier would take them down mainland Italy into the Vatican, where these secret reports were stored on a top shelf in Pacelli's library in a fake book, a red book, which had a carved-out inside, kind of like a safe.
Wow.
And so the Vatican was kept very well informed throughout the Nazi years of the transgressions of Hitler and his associates.
You mentioned the Concordat. Some people think that the very signing of the Concordat was an act of betrayal on the part of the Church. What was the Concordat? What was its function? And what was its moral status?
Well, Concordats more generally really come from the time of Napoleon, where we have states encroaching on the traditional rights of the Church, and the Church really not wanting to get involved in physical warfare with the state, wants its priests and clergy and even laity to have some legal standings. In other words, to put it on some kind of objective footing. So a Concordat is simply an agreement between the Church and the state about the respective spheres of each. And the Vatican had done many of these with many states, and especially with states where there's a difficulty in relations. And so a Concordat is not a sign that the relations between the Church and state are especially good. Just the contrary. It's a sign that there are difficulties. And with respect to Germany, of course, this is the land of the Reformation. And so for the Catholic Church to have legal standing in Germany with the state was quite an achievement. It was regarded as an achievement at the time. And if you look at the press, no one at the time said this is the Church approving of the Nazi state. Hitler, in his own mind, rather thought it was a feather in his cap, and perhaps it was. But we have to remember that the British and the French were doing naval agreements and treaties with him in this same period of time, and not one state in the world withdrew its ambassador from Germany when Hitler was elected. And Hitler was quite a popular figure throughout the world up until the outbreak of the war. So I think it would be a mistake to say that the Concordat marked an approval of Hitler's regime.
But Eugenio Pacelli, who was Vatican Secretary of State at the time, believed that this was the Nazis had to be watched. Was he ever pro-Nazi?
No, I don't think so. You know, there are here and there in some of the primary sources you'll get a report that perhaps Pacelli he didn't mind the anti-communist aspect of certain authoritarian regimes. And I think that's perhaps the most critical thing we could say from our current perspective, but there's no evidence that Pius XII or Pacelli was anti-Semitic. There's no evidence that he was pro-Nazi, because after all, they knew from the Nazis' own statements that the Nazis were neo-pagans, that they believed in the religion of the earth, which was hard and did not have mercy. The Nazis were continually associating Christianity and Judaism together as this kind of religion of the soft and the merciful, which they wanted to get away from as neo-pagans. So I think the Church thought, look, we've seen many dictators in our 2,000-year history. You know, Hitler will come, Hitler will go. Communism is a long-term threat to the Church. And I think certainly everyone underestimated what Hitler planned to do, I mean, including secular states. And I think once it was clear that Hitler was a complete madman who was going to stop at nothing and was willing to destroy the world as everyone knew it, simply for his own pathological goals, Pope Pius XII proved very amenable to what the German military resistance was willing to do, and really stepped into the breach and offered to connect them with the Western powers to try and end the war.
Yes, I want to go over that in some detail, because he did play an important role of trying to line up the internal German resistance with the English, and I want to go and have you lay out what happened there and what failed and what worked. Hitler despised the Pope, is that right?
Well, he respected Pacelli as a statesman, but the SS reports that were being sent to Hitler right at the time Pacelli was elected in March of 1939 portrayed him as a very crafty diplomat who would really resist the Nazi agenda, and particularly the racist part of the Nazi agenda. And so that was the reason that Hitler was very wary of Pacelli, Pius XII.
My guest is Mark Riebling. He is the author of Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. It is the book to read. It's a dramatic narrative, well documented. We'll come back and continue conversation. Good afternoon, I'm Al Kresta. With me, Mark Riebling, author of Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. Let's talk a little bit about this network that we mentioned, Joseph Mueller and Pope Pius XII, and Hitler, Mueller began gathering data that Pope Pius could use in his attempt to try to hold the Nazi authorities to the terms of the Concordat. How soon did Pope Pius know that the Germans were unwilling to meet the terms of the Concordat?
Well, Pacelli knew this even as the Concordat, the ink was hardly even dry on it. In fact, the very day that he was signing it, he was getting reports from Joseph Mueller about Catholic workers being beaten up, and there was a huge Catholic workers rally with a giant glass neon letter for the letter K, which is for the Kolping's network, which is what it was called in Germany. But the Nazis came with hammers and they smashed this huge glass insignium of the Catholic working movement in Germany. And this was a very dramatic statement that the Nazis were going to be violent in their resistance to the church. But I think on the way toward World War II, a really a signature moment as well was in 1937 when the SS opened an Orders Castle, as they called it, to train SS leaders, and Hitler came to cut the ribbon, as it were, at this training castle for SS, and he said that I will step on the Catholic Church like a toad. And there was a conscience-stricken cadet of Catholic background who felt compelled to report this to his bishop, but the Nazis had infiltrated an agent or secret agent or a mole into the episcopacy who found out about this report, and the Nazis were able to trace it back to this cadet. The cadet and a friend were then thrown from the Berlin-Munich express train and killed. And Pacelli, when he was briefed on this, was very, very affected by all the reports. And this was the kind of, it's almost like ISIS or something, the needless barbarism of the way this kind of thing was handled by the Nazis was really a wake-up call to Pacelli. And as well, Joseph Mueller's reports of what Hitler wanted to do vis-a-vis rearming, the time of the Rhineland occupation in 1936, all of this really pointed in one direction. But by the time Pius XII was elected in March 1939, he was very anti-Hitler and very prepared for the worst, as it were, but at the same time did not want to provoke Hitler needlessly when he could do better by working behind the scenes.
This comes up all the time when people talk about the so-called silence of Pius XII. It's common to say, well, he did speak against racism and this philosophy of blood and earth, he didn't use the word Jews very often. Once at the very beginning, I guess, of the Third Reich, and then once at the very close. Why the unwillingness to specify the Jews?
Well, I don't think it was Pacelli's unwillingness so much as the German episcopate and especially the German cardinals had cautioned Pacelli in their very first meetings with him during the week of his election. And we know this because Pius XII had taken the precaution of bugging his own audiences with these cardinals, and so we have the transcripts, and I translated them for Church of Spies. So we know really verbatim what was said in these meetings during which Pius XII formed his policy toward Hitler. And to a man, the German cardinal said, please, please, do not do anything publicly, because the Nazis are completely sensitive to considerations of prestige. So whatever you say, they're going to double down on their policy. And in fact, Hitler had said on January 30th, 1939, the 10th anniversary of his coming to power, he said, the priest as a political spokesman of the Vatican, political agent, we will destroy. And anytime foreign powers speak out against what they consider to be our brutalities, we're going to just do it even more. And this was very much in the minds of the leaders of the church as they were trying to figure out how to proceed. And so Cardinal Faulhaber of Munich, who was really the architect of Pius XII's policy, he said, look, let's have a two-track policy. Let's dial back on this rhetoric, which has been counterproductive since the Vatican had issued an encyclical in 1937, which was probably the harshest statement the Church has ever issued against the state.
And that was written largely by Pacelli while he was Secretary Secretary of State. Is that true?
It was rewritten by him. Cardinal Faulhaber wrote it, and then Pacelli punched it up and made it much more harsh and biting. And the Nazis themselves noted that all of these harsh phrases had been taken verbatim from the complaints which Pacelli was sending to Berlin for violations of the Concordat. In other words, struggle to the death, machinations, and that the Nazis had intended the destruction of the church from the very beginning. We know that this represented Pacelli's actual beliefs. And I would just underline this, however, that contrary to the way Pius XII has been portrayed by many of the liberals, such as John Cornwell or James Carroll or whatever, Pius was not a centralizer, and he was not shoving the Vatican's viewpoint on the German church. Just the opposite. Pius XII was listening to the people on the ground who would have to bear the consequences of whatever the Vatican did. And he was listening to people on the scene who said, look, we've had a real tough time over the last 10 years. We need a little bit of a relief, and there's a great danger that the German Catholics will break away or be broken away, as happened under Henry VIII in England. And, we're going to lose all these souls, and we're going to have a real problem here because Hitler is so popular with German Catholics, not because they were Catholics, but because they were Germans. And so I think, rightly or wrongly, Pacelli saw that the church, and he specifically, had kind of a weak hand. And being a realist and being concerned with practical reality, he did not want to play a weak hand unless he had to. And so he decided the better call was to listen to the people on the scene and to try and work behind the scenes against Hitler.
Yeah. By the way, that was one thing that really changed my impression. The relationship between Cardinal Faulhaber and Pius XII. I had the situation reversed in my mind. I knew they were both heroic in their own ways, but I didn't realize that Faulhaber had been the one that was, in some sense, staying the language of Pius XII. So that was very helpful to me.
Well, actually, Faulhaber was kind of a mentor to Pacelli, because when Pacelli went as papal nuncio to Munich in 1917, Faulhaber was at that time, an archbishop and soon after a cardinal, and he sort of took Pacelli under his wing. He was a generation older. Yep. And senior, and helped him with not necessarily giving him German lessons, but explaining to him German culture, and really opened a lot of doors for Pacelli and made his tenure as nuncio in Munich and later in Berlin very successful. So Faulhaber was kind of an older brother figure to Pacelli, and when Pacelli became pope, he did listen to Faulhaber more than to anyone else in terms of how to craft his policy. Was
Faulhaber the primate of Germany, or was he second?
No, No, that would have been a different fellow who was, really from Prussia and was kind of a state-appointed bishop almost, and he was one of the four who came to the meeting with the Vatican. Yes. But actually, and there were some others who Pius XII became very close to later. The Bishop of Berlin, Count Preysing, was in fact very close to Pius XII, and Preysing was very anti-Nazi. But the bishops themselves were kind of divided, and the Austrian bishops were cozy with the Nazis in a way that made Pacelli very uncomfortable. And he found himself at times having to discipline them, or to say, or to withdraw their words and saying that the church supported Hitler. So, the critics of the wartime church are not without some basis, but really it's just so overstated, and to lay it at the feet of this one pope who was actually very deeply anti-Nazi is to misrepresent what happened. And so in Church of Spies, I really try to tell the story of what Pius XII did when confronted with this terrible situation.
Yeah. Talk to me about the channels to England now. How does this work? I mean, this is a very complicated matter.
Sure. Yeah.
So we got the German bishops, and we also have the resistance within the German military. We've got the Pope. We've got the couriers. Try to paint that for me. How does it get to the English?
Well, by analogy, the way I'd just say is that imagine people in Moscow, were tired of Putin, and they wanted some way of having an interlocutor in Washington with the Obama administration, but they were afraid they'd get found out. But let's say they trusted Pope Francis, and they went to Pope Francis and they asked him to do such a thing. I'd stress that, of course, that's not happening in the real world. But if it did, you'd find a very apt analogy for what happened during World War II. And so, without giving all the proper names and the dates and everything, really what happened was that at the beginning of the war, in the first months of the war, the German resistance to Hitler, which was centered in German military intelligence, the Abwehr, they reached out to Pope Pius XII through Joey Ox, Joseph Mueller, because they knew he was trusted by the Pope and had been married at the crypt of St. Peter underneath a high altar of the Vatican. They knew he was trusted, and so they used Joseph Mueller to basically say, we want to get rid of Hitler, but we want to do a deal with the British so that we won't just have total chaos, and that the Allied military machinery won't just overrun Germany and make us slaves. We want a chance to build a free society. And this is a very delicate proposition because, of course, it could have been disinformation, it could have been a trick, and in fact there were tricks played by not the Nazis various times to entrap people, to expose dissident elements. And so Pius XII had a very fraught decision to make, but he trusted Mueller so much because this guy was such a daredevil and who'd really risked his life so many times for the church that he thought, well, I'm gonna take Mueller at his word, and I'm going to reach out to the British. So the result was a number of midnight meetings in the Vatican apartments where Pope Pius XII called in the British ambassador to the Holy See and conveyed messages from the German resistance and really hammered out a 7-point protocol, which was to take effect on Hitler's death. And it had various stipulations such as what would happen in territory X, where there would be a plebiscite, it was very detailed, very granular scenarios for what would happen in the advent of Hitler's death. And the first plot, which ran from October 1939 to April 1940, almost came to fruition, but what happened was that Hitler invaded the West, he invaded Scandinavia and then France before the plotters could get their act together, and the wind kind of went out of their sails because Hitler was yet again so popular and so victorious. The idea was that, well, the German people probably wouldn't support a revolution at that point.
Would Pope Pius XII support tyrannicide?
Wow. Well, we have the testimony of Joseph Mueller that he, as he put it, he tried very hard to avoid compromising the Vatican and putting the Vatican in a difficult position. So, in fact, when the Protestant conspirators who didn't have a well-developed doctrine of civil disobedience because of some of the things Luther had said, when they came to Mueller and said, can you get the Pope's blessing for tyrannicide, Mueller said, nothing doing. I'm not going to put the Pope on the spot like that. But the net effect of the Pope's willingness to become a co-conspirator was a tacit sanction. And the testimony is that the plotters felt much, much better, feeling that the Pope was on their side.
He made distinctions, too, between his person and the papal office.
He did. He said, I'm conspiring as the Pope, not as the Vatican. And there are technical reasons for that, which we can get into after the break if you want.
Mark Riebling, my guest. Church of Spies, the book. It's outstanding. The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. I'm Al Kresta. Good afternoon. I'm Al Kresta with Mark Riebling, the author, most recently, of Church of Spies, the Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. Before the break, Mark, we were talking about a distinction that Pope Pius XII made between committing himself as Pope, but not committing the Vatican. Give me the distinctions here so they're clear in my mind.
Well, according to Joseph Mueller, the Pope was very careful in stipulating this back to the German resistance for one basic reason, which is that the Vatican itself is a multinational enterprise. It has priests from all different countries, and it really has to remain neutral. And Pius XII also was worried that if this were found out, that the entire College of Cardinals or the entire Curia would be carted off into a concentration camp. And so he wanted to be able to say, I did this myself. Take me. The responsibility is on me. And this was an incredible assumption of personal responsibility. He wanted it to be clear that he was acting as a person and as in the person of the Pope, rather than the church being exposed to punishment. And what I'd compare this to, although it was probably motivated for different reasons, was, I don't know if you remember during the Reagan years, the Iran-Contra affair where Ollie Norris ran a secret operation out of the back door of the White House. That was Reagan acting in the person of the president rather than through his formal bureaucracy. And this was, by analogy, kind of the same thing. And in fact, this is how statesmen had traditionally engaged in intrigue and conspiracies throughout the centuries. They acted through their kitchen cabinet, as it were, their informal advisors, and it was much more secure, much more discreet, but it was also very circumspect in case things were ever found out. It would go on the Pope himself and not the Church as a whole.
Why did the English lose confidence in the German resistance?
Well, as Undersecretary Cadogan said at one point in a minute from a British War Cabinet meeting, he said, well, if they want to get rid of Hitler, why don't they get on with it already? And there were so many of these plots which had almost come to fruition. You know, it's like something you put on your resume. I almost did this. Well, you know, that kind of doesn't count after a certain point. People are concerned with what you actually did do.
Right.
And, you know, as Joseph Mueller said to the Vatican at one point, he said, you know, Hitler just has the luck of the devil. There were so many times where Hitler almost died. There was one explosion which would have killed him in Munich in November 1939, but he cut his schedule short and left the podium, and a bomb exploded just 15 minutes after he left. There was in the second plot during the war in which Pope Pius XII was involved, Hitler would have died when a bomb was planted on his plane on March 13th, 1943, but when the plane climbed to avoid flak, the fuse froze in the bomb, and Hitler survived. In that particular plot, the Bavarian Jesuits were very active as couriers, and we know that these Bavarian Jesuits were in very close touch with the Vatican, and we know who the intermediaries were, and we have some of the pieces of paper that they used to send messages. And during this second round of plots, I should mention that the Jesuits obtained the blueprints to one of Hitler's bunkers and passed them on to the German military conspirators. And the way they obtained these blueprints was that allegedly Jesuit sewage was leaking into the SS barracks at Hitler's bunkers, which adjoined a Jesuit college in Munich. And there was a lawsuit over this Jesuit sewage, and in the process the Jesuits obtained the blueprints and they passed them to the military conspirators. So this was really just some of these incredible things you could never think of, on your own. History is certainly stranger than fiction in certain ways.
What about the plot that was in the recent movie Valkyrie, that the bomb is placed in a meeting of Hitler and his high officials, and unfortunately I'm blanking on the name of the principal here.
Stauffenberg.
Yes, Stauffenberg. What about that? What was the Pope's involvement in that particular plot?
Well, there again, as in the first two, he was an intermediary with the English. And specifically, the Pope had said in some directives that he gave to a select committee of activists, Jesuits particularly, that they ought to act in defense of human beings as such, beyond denominational concerns. Mm-hmm. And this particular Jesuit named Alfred Delp took this as a call to very radical action to save Jews and to save Catholics and to save lives as such. And Father Delp met with Colonel Stauffenberg on D-Day, June 6, 1944, at Stauffenberg's home, and we know from the accounts which were later wheedled out of people by the SS that Delp had urged Stauffenberg to make a move, had said, look, your conscience should be clear. The church doctrine on this is very clear. When someone is clearly possessed by the devil and is clearly satanic, Catholics can get together and in good conscience can get rid of such a person. We know that Stauffenberg himself he had a stained glass mind. He really was Catholic in a way that, a lot of Europeans hadn't been since the time of Charlemagne. And he really looked at the church and the Holy Roman Empire as a model. He wanted to translate the idea of Christendom from the Middle Ages into a post-Hitler order. And in fact, in a certain sense, the idea of united Europe, which came into being after the World War II and came to operate in NATO and the Cold War and the Euro, all of that was a kind of displacement or secularization of the idea of Christendom, idea of the West, the non-communist West. But in the case of Father Delp, of course, when the bomb went off in Hitler's headquarters on July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg was executed because Hitler was wounded but not killed by this, and Delp and his fellow Jesuits had to go on the run. They hid in coal bins, they escaped across rooftops. Delp himself was captured, tortured, and hanged, but he kept his secrets he kept the secrets about the Vatican's role, and the SS was very frustrated. But Delp was certainly a hero. Joseph Mueller was also jailed and also resisted 200 interrogations without compromising the Holy Father. And, to him and to others, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Protestant pastor, who was also involved in these plots, we owe a great debt.
Yeah, you actually have an exchange between Bonhoeffer and Mueller, which I hadn't ever come across before in the book. And tell me a little bit about how they regarded one another. And also, if you can, Payne Best, who was arrested too at one point, he was in one of these disinformation campaigns that the Germans had caught him in. So go ahead. Yeah.
No, well, I mean, just to speak to the Bonhoeffer part and Bonhoeffer and Mueller, just to jump ahead, what we saw when Pope Francis came and he was at Ground Zero and you had people of all different faiths gathered there at the site of this incredible tragedy, that's really the personification or the transliteration of what began during the Second World War behind the scenes as what I would call lifeboat ecumenism, where people of different faiths, Christians in Germany who really hadn't spoken to each other very much since the Reformation, found themselves compelled by these terrible events to get together and to bridge their old differences. So, for instance, Joseph Mueller was asked by the German military intelligence command, which was plotting against Hitler, to bring Dietrich Bonhoeffer into the plot because in the West, particularly in England, which was very Protestant, they said, well, this resistance project is too Catholic. We need if it really is going to have a chance of success, you're going to need some Protestants involved because Germany is a largely Protestant nation. So Mueller recruited Bonhoeffer into the plot and set him up in a Benedictine monastery where Bonhoeffer came under the influence of Jesuit Father Rupert Meyer. And we know that, looking at Bonhoeffer's letters, it was from this point on that Bonhoeffer adopted the Catholic view of tyrannicide, the Catholic doctrine called the discipline of secrecy, which stipulates, that you can hide, you can act in a secret way, especially when the church is under siege by tyrants. And this cooperation between Bonhoeffer and Mueller really culminated in July 1942, when Mueller brought Bonhoeffer not only to the Vatican, but down into the Vatican crypt underneath the high altar, where the crypt keeper, a German exile, was digging for the bones of St. Peter.
Right.
And this was quite an impressive propaganda feat, I guess, if you will, because Protestants had always been sort of loath to admit that Peter had even been to Rome.
That's right.
So being able to go down these stairs and pass, 20 centuries into the first days of the church was very affecting for Bonhoeffer. And down there in the crypt, Bonhoeffer said on behalf of German Protestants, well, maybe it's true that a lot of the Reformation was motivated by the desire to seize church land and church properties. And one of the Jesuit advisors of the Pope said in his turn, well, maybe we could see how it might be that because we're in Italy, we came under the influence of Italian novels of mother-son love, and there's the whole cult of Mary, that maybe Protestants have a hard time understanding in Northern Europe. I'm just saying that it was a way of reaching out to each other to try to build bridges. And so, that's really the legacy when you look at Vatican II and you look at Nostra Aetate, which we just passed the 50th anniversary of the Vatican Statement about the moral worth of other faiths. All of these changes in the church really had their secret origin or secret genealogy, if you were, during the moral crucible of the Nazi years.
Was Bonhoeffer, if I remember correctly, didn't endure the interrogation as well as Mueller did. Is that so?
Well, that's not only Mueller's account, but that's what we have from various other sources. And, I would never try to say I could stand in another man's shoes and judge the way he behaved.
Right.
But I think here's a takeaway point, which I think is too often missed when people don't understand why the church is not in any hurry to have priests be married, although, they have been married at different times in history, which is that, when there's a dispute with the state and priests are put under pressure, if they have family members and dependents, well, then the state can put a lot more pressure on them. So, for example, when Mueller said to Bonhoeffer, why did you admit to this one little technical thing? You shouldn't have admitted that. I could have covered for you, and so on and so forth. He said, well, I have a fiancé, and they they threatened to hurt her, and that got to me. And so Bonhoeffer admitted to Mueller, essentially, that the Catholic priests were better positioned than Protestant pastors because they did not have immediate, dependents, children and wives that the Nazis could threaten and intimidate.
Everyone else taking part in the July 20th conspiracy was killed, but Mueller endured. What did he go on to do?
Well, Joseph Mueller was a CIA agent during the Cold War for about 10 years under the code name Robot. He was one of the people, the Germans, the good Germans, as it were. In fact, he was the poster boy good German. He was the first German to be labeled a good German in the Allied and American Stars and Stripes post-war press. But he was one of the what Alan Dulles called the crown jewels. Dulles was the spy chief in Europe during the war first, and he was one of the linchpins of the post-war order. He became Minister of Justice in Bavaria, prosecuted war criminals, and actually is now considered to be the godfather of the Euro, the European Economic Order.
What a man, I tell you.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. I'd love to talk with you again on this, and there's got to be a Hollywood movie behind this, so I hope we see something.
Talking about it now. We're talking about it now. So
very good.
It's been great. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much, Al.
Thank you, Mark.